So now we come to, well, the very epicenter of our topic, metaphysics, and that is Plato. Plato could be said to be, despite what I've said about the importance of the Pythagoreans, Parmenides, Plato could be said to be the real beginning of the topic of metaphysics. One has to imagine that before Plato there were a number of philosophers called sophists who were preaching a kind of subjectivism that's very, very common these days. Sophistry of that kind has made a comeback in a huge way in the last, well, however many years. 50, 10, 5, make up your own mind. Plato was, as Socrates was, Plato was against that. He was really one to oppose subjectivism by postulating objective realities that would be things that could be accessed by the human mind and that would act as stable forces in the world of opinion. Opinion could be settled by its reference to what was, the metaphysics, the ontology. This was postulated, had been postulated by Socrates, that is taken over by Plato in a very memorable way in what is called the theory of the forms, in a way I'll come to. But first of all, some words about Plato himself. Plato was born in the 5th century, the end of the 5th century, 427 BC, and lived into the 4th century, roughly 347 BC. Lived for roughly 80 years or so. And he was born either in Athens or in Aegina, Aegina is a little city on an island just outside of Athens. And he was born to aristocratic parents. That's sort of important for how he fell into some of the things that he fell into in his life. As we'll come to. Now, this world that he early on inhabited would have made him suited to a world and a life of politics. But with the exceptions that we're going to come to, he rejected, on the whole, that life and instead pursued a life of philosophy. His early influence, perhaps from the age of 14, 16, say, his early influence was Heraclitus. And Heraclitus was also the lead philosopher for one of his friends. So he had, as a school-age boy, Heraclitus was his major influence. But when he was around 20 years old, he first heard Socrates in Athens, and from that moment on, Socrates was his leading philosopher. I think Socrates saw himself as attempting to provide a stabilizing force of reason amid some of the sophistry which was dominating Athens and other places. And Plato took on that idea that sophistry had to be opposed, and it could only be opposed by a world that was, by a world, an ontology of metaphysics that was capable, as I said before, of a stabilizing force. Now, Plato had some time to be a listener to Socrates, but Socrates was put to death in Plato's 28th year. And Plato never forgot it. From that moment on, Plato made the martyr, Socrates, his mouthpiece. It's not known whether Plato wrote any dialogues before Socrates' death. He might have done. But he wrote many after Socrates' death. And Socrates plays a dominant role in them, as anyone who's read one can well attest. So Socrates' death had a profound impact and importance for Plato. Shortly after Socrates' death, which Plato, he tells us himself, wasn't present for, shortly after that death, Plato, with perhaps some of his friends, some of Socrates' other pupils, Plato retires to a place called Megara, which was also a center for philosophy. It is not far from Athens. It is around the bay, which Athens sits on, but it's a separate city, and it had its own philosophical environment, and Plato and some other of Socrates' pupils went there, perhaps to get away from the climate of Athens, which may have been thought to be detrimental to Socrates' pupils. We don't quite know. But at any rate, they did. They got out of the heat, the unpleasantness, and went to Megara. Now, this was a relief for Plato to think about what his future was. And he seems to have made up his mind at that point that it was philosophy. Now, he may have returned to Athens, but shortly after, he left for... This is all disputed what the order of this was, so you have to understand that many of these chronological ideas here, the chronology of where Plato was at any one time, there are multiple sources for this and they conflict. So I'm extracting what I think is a most plausible line here for Plato's travels. Because next, Plato went to somewhere further away, to Cyrene in North Africa, which is along the coast from Egypt. And was a city of the Greeks. I'll show you a picture here of some of the ruins. It was a city, again, which had famous mathematicians, just as he went to Megara, which had mathematicians who were notable. So he also went to Cyrene, which had mathematicians who were notable. And from there, he's reported to have traveled to Egypt, which is just along the coast. Now, the evidence that he went to Egypt is from more or less contemporary sources, but also from several centuries later, the travel writer Strabo, who visited all over Europe, the Middle East, Egypt, everywhere. We have early reports of very many places in the Middle East, including Jerusalem, from Strabo in the Roman period. And Strabo says that he was shown, this is rather comical though, shown that where Plato had stayed when he was in Egypt. You can almost imagine being the travel guide showing you, as they would in London, the Dickens slept here, or James Joyce stayed here, didn't like it, on a wall, blue wall plaque. Well, Strabo was shown in Egypt where Plato had stayed in his visit to Egypt. And Plato may well have, like supposedly Pythagoras before him, have been there to soak up some of the mythology and some of the character of the ancient world, because he remained, it seems, an admirer of the Egyptians, and that should sink in a little bit. Plato was, it seems, an admirer of the Egyptians. He mentions them later, in later dialogues, approvingly. There is every sense that for Plato, the Egyptians, though they weren't Greeks, they were not alien spirits to the Greeks. Certainly not to Plato or the Platonists. They were not alien spirits. Something to bear in mind. Having stayed there, he then travelled to Italy, to southern Italy, to visit the Pythagoreans, another group of mathematicians who were still in southern Italy. In particular, he went to visit Philolaus, who I've mentioned and quoted from, and a philosopher named Eurytus, both Pythagoreans. So we have Plato traveling around to multiple places to pick up the mathematics of the various mathematical groups that were situated outside of Athens. He seems to have made deliberate attempts to find out as much from these philosophy and mathematical centers as he possibly could. Now, from the southern Italy area where the Pythagoreans, Philolaus and Eurytus were, he then, perhaps unadvisedly, travelled to Sicily, to Syracuse, there to talk to the, what could one call him, the demagogue of Syracuse, whose name was Dionysius I. Now, the chronology here is unsure, but it may be the case that, as we are later told, as we're not told by Plato, but as we're later told by some authors, that things went horribly bad for Plato, and that it was on this visit that Dionysius I, not liking what he was being told by Plato, possibly about how to be a good, wise leader, how to rule the city justly, which was one of Socrates' themes that Plato had taken on, trying to tell the dictator, probably a modern word for it, but that's what he was, Dionysus, how he should run his city, how he should run his area in Sicily, fell foul of him and Plato found himself sold into slavery. And it was only by, in a slave market, being recognized by one of his friends that he was rescued. If that hadn't happened, God knows what would have become of him. At any rate, Plato then returned to Athens and established his academy, and from there, presumably with money that he had inherited, of which he must have had some, from there he seems to have largely stayed, although perhaps again, unwisely, he made in his life at least 2 more trips to southern Italy and Sicily. Sicily in particular, invited back by his friend Dion, who we may well come back to. However, let's now go to our main topic. Plato wrote about many things. He wrote about ethics, he wrote about how to form a just society, what justice was, the theory of knowledge, many things. But what I'm going to do is concentrate on Plato's theory of the forms, because that was Plato's major contribution to philosophy, his enduring contribution. We have it from Bertrand Russell's co-author of Principia Mathematica in the early 20th century, Whitehead, A.N. Whitehead. We have this statement from Whitehead on Plato's importance. He said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." The European tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. It's become a very famous saying from Whitehead, and one could say it's not an exaggeration. Though one may say that the Pythagoreans and Parmenides were very important influences on Plato because so little of their writing has survived, much of what we know about them also comes through Plato. It's absorbed into Plato, and it comes manifest in Plato's metaphysics most profoundly and clearly, and that is mainly the theory of forms. Now, it may be that that theory of forms comes from Socrates as well. That idea comes from Socrates, because, as I said before, Socrates was against the subjective character that had come to dominate the thought about ethics and what the nature of good and the good society was. It had come to almost be as subjectivism, as we know today, often is, a justification of totalitarianism and of a lack of respect for the individual. Subjectivism becomes a kind of pragmatism where the leaders may do what they will, whatever they want to, because whatever they want is what is just. What they say goes. So what they say is just goes. Well, Socrates may have opposed that with his own character of the idea of an objective good, a good which is not subjective, but which holds to definitions, which holds to the character of definitions, and those definitions may well have been the Socratic origin to the forms. If you can define the just in a particular way, if you can define the good in a particular way, then the good has as its essence a form. It had the different behaviours that are just have as their essence the definition, which becomes the form. So Socrates may well have initiated this move towards the forms, and sometimes the early accounts of Plato's forms are called Socratic, so the Socratic forms. However, a more accurate name for them, a more descriptive name for them, would be immanent forms. Immanent forms. Because immanent forms are, just as all of the instances of just behaviour fall under the definition of the just, and all good behaviour falls under the definition of the good, so one can re-say that as, well, the good behaviour has as its essence this thing called the form of the good. It's not much of a change, and that immanence means that the good, the form of the good, is entirely present in each of the good acts. The form of the just is present in each of the just acts. The form of the pious or the holy is in each of the holy acts, the pious acts, and so on. The form of the beautiful is in each of the things that is the beautiful. The form of the good is in each of the things that is good. Now, we have this in an early dialogue stated called the Euthyphro dialogue. The Euthyphro. We find Socrates on the day in which he's been charged with impiety, meeting someone outside the magistrate's office, whose name is Euthyphro, and they have a discussion, so Plato says, on the pious or holiness. It means the same thing. Now, here is one of the earliest introductions from Plato of his idea of the forms. He says, this is in the Euthyphro at line 5d. He says, is not the pious, or holiness, always the same with itself in every action? And likewise the impious, is it not the complete contrary of the pious, yet always identical with itself, and possessing one single form in respect of its impiety? Does not this apply to everything that can be characterized as unholy, and whatever is to be unholy possessing some one characteristic quality? So here you have the idea. The holy has one characteristic quality, and by contrast, and this is unusual, the unholy, the impious, also has one characteristic quality, the impious itself, the impious in and of itself, the impious form. So there is a form for impiety and the impious acts, and there is a form for the pious and the pious acts. And here we have it said in this dialogue, where Plato has been charged with impiety. That was the charge that Socrates was facing, the charge of impiety. And that charge is one that Socrates discusses with Euthyphro, and what Socrates chases Euthyphro to find is, well, the form for impiety. If there is such a thing as impiety, what is it? What has he been charged with? What might he be sent to death for? What has been his charge? It is this charge of impiety. So he pursues Euthyphro for this matter, and even though Euthyphro is someone, sort of a fanatic religious person who is on the side of piety, it turns out that Euthyphro does not know what the pious is in the end. So here we have the template for the later dialogues. In the later dialogues, in particular, the Phaedo and the big one, the Republic, and also the Symposium, those three really articulate the central doctrine of the forms in what is called Plato's middle period. There is then an evolution of his ideas about the forms in his later works, which becomes a very controversial issue as to exactly what they have evolved into, if anything. But in the middle period, we have very confident assertions, it seems, starting off in the Phaedo, which is the dialogue of the day of Socrates' death, then to the Republic and the Symposium, both of which state, with different degrees of emphasis, what the forms really are. And that's where it becomes more than the early Euthyphro idea of it simply being, as it were, an objective thing that correlates to a definition. In the Phaedo and in the Republic, Symposium as well, it evolves into this, what we would think of as the forms proper, and what philosophers have later called, as opposed to the theory of immanent forms, the theory of transcendent forms. When people talk about Plato's theory of forms, it's true that mostly what they are referring to is the theory of transcendent forms, as you find it stated pretty clearly in the Republic. And that is what I will take up next time. Thank you.